Welcome to the SSAA Victoria Podcast. Our guest on the podcast today is Neal Finch. Neal spent the last 25 years or so researching and actively managing Australian wild animals, both as pests and as valued sustainable resources, often both things at the same time. Neal taught wildlife management at the University of Queensland for about 20 years. He also spent about 13 years with the Queensland Government's kangaroo program. He has a degree in environmental science from Griffith University and an honours degree in wildlife science from the University of Queensland. Neal's currently the EO of the Australian Wild Game Industry Council, which evolved from the Kangaroo Industry Association a couple of years ago. I'm really looking forward to the discussion with Neal today on a range of topics, but first, a bit of a roundup of what SSAA Victoria's been up to. So we've been busy in Spring Street advocating on shooting and hunting issues as always. The state budget here in Victoria will be handed down next week, and we've been pushing to have things that we like funded or funding maintained for things that we like and things that we don't like defunded. Realistically, though, I don't expect very much to happen in the state budget at all. The money is very tight at the moment, and any surpluses there are to spend, you'd have to suspect that the government will be looking to spend them next year, which is an election year, rather than rolling them out this year. So not looking to much news there. We've had the chair of the Victorian Firearm Consultative Committee resign, and a new chair is about to be appointed. It's a bit of an insider issue, I suppose, but it's really important. It's the peak advisory group to the Police Minister on firearms issues, so it's important we get that right. So we've been spending a fair bit of time in Spring Street and talking to a few people to make sure that the incoming chair is someone that shooters can work with, who understands us and who's going to give us a fair go. Also been some recent recommendations from the state coroner that are concerning, probably very well intentioned, of course, but they'd have pretty clear negative consequences if they were implemented. So we've been spending a lot of time talking to people in government to make sure they understand the potential negative consequences of just following the coroner's recommendations, while still honouring the intent of it and doing what we can to keep the community safe. Concerningly, gun control groups have been walking the halls in Spring Street, spruiking a recent report that people might have seen, a paper by the Australia Institute. Now, that paper was commissioned by and funded by Gun Control Australia, so we're now having to spend a fair bit of time going door to door to politicians, correcting some of the blatant falsehoods in that paper that, frankly, are not aimed at community safety at all. They're aimed at making it harder for law-abiding licensed firearm owners. So fortunately, we've got the facts on our side on that one. And also it's really good to see SSAA national body stepping up and coordinating campaigns and responses to that across the states, so that what we're doing in Victoria is complemented by our opposite numbers, or our colleagues in other states doing the same thing and sending the same message. So that's fantastic to see. On a more proactive front, we happily attended a debate on Melina Barth MP's record-breaking petition against the creation of new national parks just earlier in the week. So more than 40,000 people signed that petition, which is a record. I think it's the biggest since suffrage came in Victoria, which was obviously using a bit older tech than they use today. There was really good speeches in the House on Wednesday night from a wide range of MPs. And it's been a really great coming together of groups. So we're in Parliament House with us from SSAA Victoria. There were people from Field and Game Australia, the Australian Deer Association, the Mountain Cattlemen's Association, and a raft of other outdoor recreation groups. So good to all be in the same place at the same time and catch up for a nice beer afterwards. We've been pushing MPs in Parliament to start a pilot program for the Hunters for the Hungry, which is something we push every year, and we've been supporting with what is now the annual Hunters for the Hungry Game Meat Barbecue. So this November will be the third year that we've been running that barbecue on the terrace in Parliament House, and last year it was attended, as people would have seen, by the Premier and the Opposition Leader and a wide range of ministers and MPs. So it's getting bigger and bigger each year, and that's great, and it's a nice sort of friendly thing to do, but there's that more important message behind that barbecue, which is that this is a really good food source that is far too often going to waste, that could be going to a far better purpose. We've also been pushing for more access for deer hunting in particular. So there's been a 542% increase in the number of deer hunters in Victoria since 1996, but no corresponding increase in the amount of public land available. So we've been having a really red-hot push with government in national park access in particular. So places like Mount Buffalo, the Snowy River, the Errinundra and the Cooperacambra are places that we say could very easily be opened up for access for deer hunting without really negatively impacting the experience of other bush users and potentially having those triple bottom line benefits. So having good environmental outcomes, good social outcomes, good economic outcomes. It's a win-win-win, so we're hopeful that the government will take us up on those offers sometime soon. Our national leaders at SSAA attended a meeting in Canberra on Wednesday this week that was hosted by SIFA, the Shooting Industry Foundation. It's early days, but the goal of that was to foster a more unified front amongst the shooting world. And SSAA Victoria is actually hosting a similar meeting late next month, so late June, here in Victoria to get shooting groups and hunting groups together with a goal of going to government together for the next year's state election with a joint log of claims. So we'll keep you posted on how that goes. We've also been talking to quite a few MPs and taking them shooting, even helping a few progress further than that and get their shooters licences. So this is the sort of program we do throughout the year, and it's all aimed at trying to build that individual understanding amongst decision makers that shooting's something that's safe and enjoyable and rewarding. Those sorts of things typically don't go publicised, so a lot of MPs wouldn't necessarily want their constituents to know that they've come down to the range and had a shoot, so we do those sorts of things out of hours and very quietly. But I can assure you that everyone that does come and have a shoot with us leaves with a big smile on their face and wanting to come back for more. And like I said, quite a few are now progressing and getting their shooters licences, which is great. So all of that aside, I'll get to the main cut and thrust of today, which is our discussion with Neal Finch. So welcome to the podcast, Neal.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It is absolutely our pleasure. You and I caught up here in Victoria a few weeks ago. You shouted me a nice Vietnamese lunch, which was much appreciated. Just for the listeners, viewers at home, a bit of background on yourself, Neal, where you grew up and where your shooting journey comes from.
Yeah, mate. I grew up in Brisbane back in the 1970s. I never understood as a kid why everyone referred to Brisbane as a big country town. When I look back at the experience that I had, it definitely was a big country town, and I'm very thankful for that. I was actually thinking about it today. It wasn't unusual to see someone, to set a traffic lights on their motorbike with a dog on the tank of their motorbike. It also was not unusual to see someone with a rifle case, clearly with a rifle in it, on the back whilst riding through town on a motorbike as well. And like many young teenagers, I bought my first 22 from Kmart when I was 13 years old. It was very common. It was just a natural progression from having slingshots and air rifles. You get a 22. So that was just what the atmosphere that I grew up in the 1970s, early 80s in Brisbane. I joined the SSAA when I was 13, I think. My local range was the Belmont range. And when I got progressed through to working to Woolworths on a Thursday night, Saturday morning, I would finish work on a Saturday and get my father to drop me off at the Belmont range, and he'd pick me up at closing. And then on Sunday, he'd drop me off first thing in the morning. I'd be there all day. So I'm no stranger to ranges, but I'm not a competition shooter by any stretch of the imagination. I just, I grew up in that atmosphere and I enjoyed it, even though my direct parents weren't actively shooters or hunters. My extended family was.
I've actually been out to Belmont a few years ago. It's a pretty good facility, and I was blown away by how close it is to town.
Yeah, well, of course, when it was set up, it was very much in the sticks, and certainly when if I recall, the mid '80s going down there after work, it was a long drive. It was significant that you're going out to the range and it was in bush. But the range has had some significant environmental benefits for the greater Brisbane area. The template behind the Belmont range is significant because they shoot some very large calibers. It's next door to a long rifle, like a 600-metre range, I think. And it's got shotgun facility. There's several clubs all in a precinct, so the template behind it is very large. And it's one of the biggest koala habitat areas in that southeast Queensland area, and it remains so today because no one can go into that bushland behind the ranges.
Oh, great. Am I right in saying there was Commonwealth Games? They did some shooting there.
100%, mate. Yes, they did. All the shooting events was held at Belmont in 1982.
Very faded memories. I would have been about 6 years old. I seem to recall Lisa Curry, but that's about it. So from being a shooter, you've always had an interest in wildlife, Neal?
Yeah, well, really the two were always one and the same for me. Like my parents had a property at Stanthorpe, which was about a 3-hour drive from Brisbane. My uncle had a small crops farm down there, and I used to go and work on weekends and school holidays with him. And of course, there were no end of vermin that needed controlling. So that's kind of that was my active introduction, if you like, to hunting. And I was a bit unusual because everybody else was more than happy to just shoot animals and leave them rot because they're pests. That never floated for me. I always wanted to eat them. I used to tan the skins. I had buckets under my mother's laundry tub full of skinned and tanned animals. And I would make like key rings out of rabbit's feet. And one of my first girlfriends received a pair of rabbit feet earrings, but that relationship didn't last long. So maybe that was the wrong. Yeah, I don't know. But for me, it was just, I was never driven to just kill animals. It was more, it was always, I was fascinated by stalking animals, by just seeing them. It didn't matter. I would hunt them with or without a bow and arrow, a slingshot, a rifle, nothing. I was just driven to engage one-on-one with the wildlife. And more off, overwhelmingly, it was just about finding animals, knowing where to find them, and then getting as close as you could. That was just always exciting to me. And yeah.
Straight out of school into uni studying wildlife, or? No,
mate. I out of school into the trades. I was an electrical fitter mechanic by trade, and then I ended up sharpening saws for 10 years.
Right. So,
which I worked for myself and put myself through university. I didn't even turn a computer on until I was 25 years old.
There you go. And went to university, studied biology.
Yeah, well, environmental science at Griffith. And that I started in 1993. So I was already 25 years old when I started. And sharpening saws was lucrative. Worked for myself. I worked on site, and I profited from urban sprawl. All those houses on the outskirts of Brisbane had builders who were blunting saws. I could turn up on site and sharpen those saws and keep them going. I did it for many years, and what I saw was that, that we can't continue to grow like that forever, right? Like it was just, and I'm deeply uncomfortable by it, right? And I spent all my weekends getting out of town anyway. I travelled for a year overseas, and I ended up spending most of my time in Africa. I started driving trucks, taking tourists around, but I ended up working on a ranch up in Laikipia district in North Africa. And I was there for a long time. I helped build an abattoir for zebra. We had 200 people working on the property, and everyone lived on zebra, even though we had cattle, sheep and goats and camels. There's domestic stock. We never ate the domestic stock. Everybody lived on the wild zebra. My first wildlife survey was wild zebra in Kenya, which was pretty exciting. But I met people doing PhDs in zoology while I was there. And coming from a working class background, my brother's a tradesman, I'm a tradesman, it was sort of like we work with our hands. We're not we're not smart. Spending time with scientists, zoologists in Kenya made me realize that they're no smarter than me. They just happen to take a different pathway to get to where they're going. And so I came back to Australia and enrolled in university. And I guess I've never really looked back. I'm blessed with being able to have a job and a career in an area that I was always passionate about, and I still am.
Oh, fantastic. And you mentioned you joined SSAA at a young age. You've had sort of in the years I've been around and been active in different roles in hunting and shooting, you've had a fair bit to do with SSAA professionally as well.
I was Yeah, I was blessed to be invited to be part of their expert advisory group that existed for quite a few years there, with some other similar-minded people, academics, I suppose you would call us. And yeah, that was an exciting time. Really good to be able to meet the executive of SSAA National, work on some pretty significant projects like the Deer Research Project here in Queensland that SSAA were heavily involved with. Hunter Survey Australia-wide, SSAA were significantly involved in that as well. So yeah, it's been a long involvement, and I hope a symbiotic one. I hope I personally got a lot out of it. I hope the SSAA has.
And they're both, certainly for their time, but even now, if you look at them, really fascinating projects, and out of the box, you don't see much research into deer that's not completely unsympathetic to deer. That Red Deer Research Project was looking at the deer as an animal, not looking at the deer as a problem so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It had goals on several layers. So we did some basic research on red deer. So we did some survey techniques, and back then there wasn't a lot of published research on wild deer, and there was a lot of talk starting to happen about wild deer, but not a lot of actual facts. So we set out to test multiple ways of counting deer in the wild in the Australian environment, and we published a paper on that. We looked at their movement patterns. We collared 20 deer with GPS collars, and we had another 30 that were collared with VHF collars. And we had honours students, master students, PhD students come through the program. We had lots of volunteers from the Australian Deer Association, the Sporting Shooters Association. We also had Safari Club International contribute to the project and come out and assist as well. But and it was really the first time some government departments within Queensland had worked side by side with some non-government organisations that were revolved around hunting and shooting. So we had Biosecurity Queensland heavily involved in that program. We also had National Parks and Wildlife and the Toowoomba Regional Council. So we had state government and local government actively contributing side by side with volunteers from shooting groups. And we had the shooting groups working together on matters of involving deer, and working side by side with students through the university coming through. I'm always pleased to bump into students, past students who came through as volunteers. So they would come out to Crestbrook Dam where the research was focused, and they would learn how to track deer, learn how to count deer, do fecal pellet counts, all sorts of things. And then they'd voluntarily come back in their own time, repeatedly, and spend time with hunters who no guns. There was no firearms. There was tranquilizer guns for darting, collaring deer, but there was no shooting of deer involved. And the project went for 6 years, and I think we established some really strong networks through that project. And today I meet people employed as wildlife biologists, and they instantly remember the Deer Project because they were a volunteer when they were a student, and that's always a good feeling.
Yeah, it's great, and I suppose the thing that people who don't like deer don't get is that they're such a fascinating animal. That's a wallaroo there. That's a fascinating animal. A red deer is a fascinating animal. A sambar deer is a fascinating animal. They're all, the Australian model of wildlife management is pretty unique in the world in that if animals are introduced, we need to demonise them. We can't put any positive values on them whatsoever. They have to be the devil incarnate to justify the incredibly low welfare outcomes that we throw at them and we tolerate as a society, and the disrespectful way in which we waste those animals. If we were to give them the respect that they deserve, just as any native animal, whether it's overabundant or threatened and endangered, as an individual, they're all amazing creatures. They all deserve respect. And they will all die. That's the thing I think a lot of people in society forget, is that if you're alive, you're going to die. How you die
If humans are involved, that can be important. When and why you might die if humans are involved, that's important too.
But to that social science thing, it sounds simple to people like you and I, but you can like and value these animals and still achieve the management outcomes that people are interested in.
Yeah, fascinating question, because it's something that inherently to me is it's not a question, it's not up for question. And I think societies globally for thousands of generations could love, respect, revere, worship an animal whilst wearing it on their back and eating it. And in fact, the fact that you could eat it, wear it on your back, was an impetus to love, respect, honour the animal. I think First Nations cultures everywhere have a lot to teach us about wildlife management. I think the current model where we must hold, revere, and somehow worship these animals as sentient beings, to be removed as if they were on a television screen, and we're somehow distant in our civilized culture, and the interaction. So, we should leave only footprints, take only photographs. It just is. It seems to me to be this really unique and strange relationship with the living world that is really, really, really recent in our development as a civilization, and to me it sort of reeks of affluent ignorance, and just I just don't feel it. I just don't get it. I see it. I'm exposed to it everywhere, and I just like. How can you respect First Nations people and their right to their culture and their connection to their environment, but not actually share it, like not actually understand that everything kills something in order to be alive? Whether you take antibiotics and you kill them by the billion because they're inside your own ecosystem in your body, or whether you go to the shops and you buy some eggs or some pork or whatever it may be. Like, if you eat a loaf of bread, there were millions of rodents killed getting that bread to you one way or the other. It's bizarre.
It's a perplexing disconnect, I suppose.
I think as hunters in a modern culture, like in a first world affluent society, we're sort of demonized for wanting to engage as a predator with an animal, and to acknowledge our place in the ecosystem, and yet ours is an entirely natural relationship, and a respectful and natural relationship. Those people who, they believe that no harm is good. They're fooling themselves, right? But I respect people's other views and opinions, and I hope to, I hope they could respect ours.
Yeah, for sure. Which sort of brings us back to some of that research that was happening way back in the early 2000s in that Red Deer project. Certainly the first larger scale study that we saw on the social science of hunters in Australia, which was the expenditure and motivations, was a part of that, along with the let's look at the deer, let's look at the hunters as well.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. It was always an important component of that project. I think today it's still the only peer-reviewed science publication that looked at hunters in Australia, not as a commissioned report, but actually as an academic pursuit. And it's interesting. It still gets referenced by surveys of hunters around the world today. So, and I don't think the results were in any way surprising. They're certainly comparable with other nations around the world, and I think it puts Australian hunters in perspective.
Yeah, it's a good bit of work that still stacks up. So it certainly still springs to mind when I discuss these issues. Another thing you did, somewhat in conjunction with SSAA, I suppose, it'd be a decade ago now, was Sustainable Use of Wildlife Conference up there in Brisbane.
Yeah, 2016. Absolutely. Yep. That was hosted in Brisbane through the University of Queensland. I just corrected before. I think you said I was with UQ for 20 years. I was with UQ for 12 years.
All right.
That's all right. In case someone from UQ is listening and they want to pull me up on that, it was 12 years I was with the University of Queensland, 13 years with the Queensland Government. The Sustainable Use of Wildlife Conference, that was sort of take two on a conference that happened in 1992, actually, and published in 1994. Back in the late 90s, sustainable use of wildlife was a very important topic. There were quite a lot of conferences, a lot of publications, a lot of people talking about the sustainable use of wildlife. The IUCN, International Conservation for Nature, actually outlines the sustainable use of wildlife as an important land use component that can contribute to conservation outcomes when it's done properly. And there was some really strong pushback in the 90s where people were saying, well, you can't use anything, it's wrong. And we had these counter arguments and that. But there was some really important work showcased, if you like, in 1992 conference. And the team I was involved with at UQ, who were teaching the sustainable use of wildlife, we had a strong network, not just within Australia, but sort of around the world. And we thought, look, it was timely to showcase and highlight the sustainable use of wildlife again. So, 2016, that conference. And, I think we had some brilliant speakers from the US, North America, Canada, as well as the US, Africa, and the United Kingdom. We had people come out from there. We had someone come out from the Middle East as well, but really showcased some brilliant work being happening around Australia. So that was really, really good.
Yeah, certainly. It's one of my great memories, and the exposure it gave you to the sympathetic ways of thinking, I suppose, and wildlife management. I still think back and harken back to talks on the management of the grey partridge in the UK and what we can learn for quail here in Australia from those sorts of things.
Yep, absolutely. No, it was a great event, and would be nice to see another one at some future point in Australia.
Yeah, a lot to do to make that happen, I suppose.
Now, a lot of work.
The main reason we've got you on today is to talk about the Churchill Fellowship.
Oh, excellent. Yep, that'd be good.
So, for those who don't know, what is a Churchill Fellowship?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I think you'd have to have lived under a rock to not heard of Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister who led the United Kingdom against the Axis forces, which was principally Nazi Germany and other countries at that time. It was interesting. My parents lived through the Blitz in London, both of them, and they both went to their grave. Some of their lasting, strongest memories was related to bombing of London. And when I was a kid in the 70s growing up, I probably couldn't have told you the Prime Minister of Australia. I definitely couldn't have told you who the Prime Minister of England was, but I certainly knew who Winston Churchill was. He was a very prominent figure in our household. But he was he was an incredibly complex personality, strong personality. And I won't hark on too much on him himself, other than to say when he was dying right at the end of his life, the Prime Minister of England came to him at the time and said, look, when you're gone, we're going to build an incredible monument to Winston Churchill. You pretty much saved the Western democracies as we know it. And that's how important he was, right? The whole world would look very different if England had not have stood up to Nazi Germany the way that they did through his leadership. Because interestingly, the head of the armed forces and most of the political leaders at the time they wanted to appease Hitler.
Yeah,
they did not want to fight him. They thought they would lose, and they wanted to. And Winston Churchill said, "No, Nazis are inherently evil. We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them to the end. We won't give up." So he's dying, and the Prime Minister says to him, "We're going to build some immense monument to you. You're still alive. You can have a say in it. What would you like?" And he said, "Oh, I reckon I don't want a building or a bronze statue." He's got them anyway. But he said, "I think it would be great if you could set up a trust." And if you could have people from the Commonwealth passionate people, apply to travel through the trust, and the trust will fund them to travel overseas to learn and bring their learnings back to their home country to improve their society. And that's been going on ever since. Australia, the Churchill Fellowship exists in the UK, in Canada, in New Zealand and Australia, but Australia really embraced the Churchill Fellowship. Our Prime Minister at the time, Menzies, was a huge fan of Winston Churchill and what he'd done. And when he did die, the word hit Australia instantly, and there was a rollout of thousands of people who went door knocking, door to door. It was just 1966, I think, or 60s. Don't quote me on the year. And they collected all this money. And the banks opened on a Sunday. Never happened in Australia's history before. And they opened on a Sunday to receive the money raised for the Churchill Fellowship. Now, the program's been going ever since. And last year when I applied, there was 104 applicants, I think, give or take. This year there's been 108. Sorry, there's been successful applicants who've received funding to travel. And there's been some really significant bodies of work from Churchill Fellows who've travelled the world. And the idea is you apply for funding, you in your area that you're passionate about, you go overseas, you talk to people who are doing things differently than they would be in Australia. You learn from that. You come back and you hopefully share that finding, and you can hopefully make some positive changes.
What a legacy.
The
whole freedom of the Western world's a pretty good legacy in and of itself. But
it is, mate. Like, to stand up to all the other leaders at the time and say, no, we're going to fight these people. And then to be able to galvanise the population of the UK to stand up against a force who was overwhelmingly more powerful than them, and to say, nah, you're not crossing this channel. We're not going to capitulate, and we'll die trying, but you're not coming. So yeah, he was a significant person of the 20th century, that's for sure.
But the other part of that legacy is this fellowship that's still going.
It's incredible, and it's strong, right? They get over 1,000 applicants a year in Australia, and they award over 100 fellowships. That's just growing. The money's been incredibly well invested and managed by volunteers from the Churchill Trust, and they can continue to fund more Churchill Fellows each year. The average spend is around $30,000 on a fellow, and it can be between 2 to 4 weeks to 8 weeks, so 1 to 2 months worth of travel anywhere in the world.
What did you pitch to them to get your fellowship?
Well, it's your passion, right? So I'm passionate about the sustainable use of wildlife, and I knew that there was things happening in Australia that I was deeply uncomfortable about, and I could play the game. I could talk the talk and walk the walk in Australia to continue my career getting funded as a wildlife biologist, or I could explore other ways of doing it and hopefully bring a more respectful and balanced way of managing wildlife in this country. So I pitched to them what I knew about wildlife management in Europe, and particularly game management, so and commercially utilising wildlife in Europe. And I was successful, and I managed to travel over there for 2 months, and I went to Spain, France, Belgium, and the UK.
Oh, and what did you do when you were there?
Well, yeah, surprisingly enough, I talked to a lot of people, which is kind of the purpose of your fellowship travels. I met with people who harvest wild game. I met with people who process wild game, people who wholesale, retail. I met with scientists and research organisations who are interested in the wildlife per se, not necessarily the game management side of it, although they were involved in that as well. I met with government officials, met with veterinarians, I met with lobby groups. So it was a fascinating journey and eye-opening. I thought after nearly 30 years of reading on this topic and learning about game management and wildlife management around the world, I thought I knew something. And I know a bit. There's nothing like turning up and communicating with people face to face to really find out how little you know. It's an amazing experience.
Something that struck me that you were saying the other week was the lack of I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but the lack of a delineation between the commercial and the recreational hunter when it comes to the sustainable use of game meat in Europe was something that was quite surprising.
Oh, like leading up to it, I was emailing people and setting up, meetings and sending them questions. And there was this sort of disconnect that I thought might have been a language barrier sort of thing. Having, lived and worked in Australia, the commercial shooters, particularly kangaroo shooters, and the non-commercial shooters in Australia, there's very little communication or unification between these groups whatsoever. They are talked about as two completely separate entities. They're managed through regulation by entirely different levels of regulation. They are two different things. And in my mind, going over to Europe, I was interested in talking to both groups, but I wanted to talk to the commercial people. And I kept on asking these questions, and they kept on flicking me over to these groups that I thought represented the greater hunting community, not necessarily the commercial hunters. When I got there, I soon found out why. It's because there is no difference in Europe. The representative bodies for hunters talk to, FACE, which is the Federation of Conservation and Hunters in Europe. They talk to on behalf of 7.5 million hunters. They also talk on behalf of commercial game meat. They're one and the same. I went out on a Monterrey in Spain. 90 red deer and half a dozen wild boar were harvested that day by people who are non-commercial hunters. But those animals went through the commercial supply chain. So the commercial processors were there to collect the animals and process the animals. They're one and the same thing, which in the Australian context, very hard to grasp. But that in itself leads to some really interesting things at a regulatory level and at a lobbying level, because those two activities are in unison, if you like.
Yeah, it's if you look at it, if you step back and look at it, it makes perfect sense, right? Like you're managing a wildlife population for whatever objective, whether the person killing them's getting paid or doing it as a recreation's pretty well irrelevant, isn't it?
As far as the animal's concerned, it is. Absolutely. And I mean, the other interesting thing in Europe is that there's very little wastage. Harvested animals are utilised. And if they're not utilised in the commercial supply chain, they're utilised locally. But we have a very large shoot to waste model in Australia. It doesn't matter how big you are. It's not just introduced species, right? It's not just these highly invasive animals like, rabbits or pigs or whatever you want to call it, where we can demonize them and they're not native, they ain't from around here, so we can just lay them to waste any way we like. It happens with highly abundant and invasive kangaroo species as well, which is, part of the tragedy. And part of the reason I went there was to look at this more respectful way of managing wildlife.
Yeah, which again, you stand back and look at it objectively, and it's, I don't know, it's complex, I suppose, the barriers, but all this really good protein that could be getting used, just getting shot to waste. There's something to my mind that's a bit obscene about that.
I've never been comfortable with it. It's Australia is pretty unique in doing this. And there's a lot of people in the world, and a lot of hungry people in the world, and there's a lot of people who might have food, but they're very protein deficient. And if you tell those people how we manage large vertebrates in Australia, like, we just poison them en masse because they're a pest, and to do it any other way would be expensive and difficult and take some time. It's very hard to have that conversation. When you go to a wildlife conference with other academics in the research area, as soon as you leave Australia, outside of New Zealand and maybe Hawaii, the rest of the world don't see wildlife to be killed disrespectfully and wastefully the way we do. We just take it as the norm. We justify it by demonizing these animals, and then we treat them with the lowest welfare outcomes because they're pests and we just want to get rid of them. And yeah, that just doesn't happen. Certainly doesn't happen in Europe or North America. That's for sure. And you wouldn't do it in the third world.
But by the same measure, and this is where it gets super bizarre, people who profess, and I'm sure sincerely believe they have a deep care for these animals and wildlife in Europe and America, are pushing for bans on kangaroo leather. So pushing on the actual respect and utilisation of these shot wildlife, I assume it's on some bizarre misunderstanding that they then won't die.
It is. Yeah, like there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of blinkered perspective. People look at a cause and effect, but they don't look at a bigger picture. Like they're really not standing back. It's a case of, missing the forest for the trees. So which is sad, but this is something that hopefully through talking about these things, like what we're doing now, hopefully more people can learn to engage respectfully with people who think differently to them, act differently to them, and potentially take on a more holistic view of wildlife management and relationship with wildlife.
So from all that, what have you brought back that we can use here in Australia?
Yeah, well, hopefully some useful things. So, straight up, this relationship between the commercial industry and the non-commercial harvesting. We call it recreational harvesting in Australia. I think society as a whole probably has this problem with the term recreational tied in with hunting, which is killing an animal. So because if you're not actively involved in that, there's possibly this connection that the recreation is the killing.
Yeah.
And anyone involved knows that's not correct. It's a bit like sport hunting is also another sort of connection of two words when you put them together. Historically, they've been used, right? And they've been around a long time, so there's a continued use. But in today's society, if you put those two words together, it can people who aren't involved, they bring what they know about hunting, or that's killing an animal, and what they know about sport, and they put those two things together and they go, well, that's not right. Same with recreation, it's like you put those two words together. So I think that disconnect between commercial harvesting and non-commercial harvesting, I'm very keen to build very strong bridges and networks, relationships in Australia between those two communities. That's one thing. The other thing in Europe that is sort of really prevalent is the relationship between landowners and hunters, those who are harvesting and managing the wildlife. So FACE is a lobby group to the European Parliament. I said before, they represent 7.5 million hunters across European countries. They're the secretariat to the European Parliament in matters of biodiversity and conservation, and they share that with the European Landowners Association. So that relationship is really strong, and the reason it's strong is because the agricultural departments, the government departments, license hunting through the agricultural departments. So in Spain, you get your license through the agricultural department. The agricultural department has a policy that states hunters are the principal tool used for managing wildlife. It's actually there. It's a very recent document. In France, that they have over 1 million licensed hunters there. They're the nation with the most amount of licensed hunters. They did have a department of hunting, and they had a department of biodiversity. And last year they amalgamated the two into the one department because they're one and the same, right? So there's that relationship. And it's because landowners look to hunters to manage their wildlife issues. But in many instances, the landowners get a financial remuneration from the hunters, and the hunters are very pleased to pay to be part of that land management. And it goes back a long way. It happens to a small extent in Australia, but I think there's significant scope to strengthen the relationship between the landowners and farmers and those who harvest wildlife, who could manage the wildlife issues that they have on their properties. And I think there's certainly some scope for some payment arrangements to make it more attractive for landowners to engage with harvesters, whether they're commercial or non-commercial or both. And I think there's certainly scope for the organisations to be more connected in representing their interests. So there's a couple of key things that I brought back.
Yeah, that's all great, and hopefully something we can keep working on together over the next few years and keep developing, maturing, I suppose, this conversation in Australia about wildlife management. It strikes me, particularly when I look at the deer world, when I look at it, it strikes me that the Australian conversation is very immature.
It's fascinating. It from a purely social science perspective, if you're a North American or a European sociologist, you would do a PhD on Australia to just see how these so-called civilized people connect and relate to millions of sentient wild animals. It's on one hand, it's native. We must be protected at all costs. You cannot harm a hair on its head. It's introduced. Kill it any damn way you like.
Yeah.
And don't utilize it. We just get rid of it. And of course, we've been doing this for generations, and we do it with public money, millions of dollars of it every year, right? So it's a very globally unusual model. It just doesn't happen in other parts of the world.
Well, that's a sobering note to leave us on, I suppose. Any other final thoughts from you, Neal, or things you wanted our listeners to take home with them?
Thank you very much for having me on. If you're passionate about your interest area, I would encourage you to look into the Churchill Fellowships. They're a wonderful program, and they'll take on anyone with an interest. The diversity of fellowships is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
We'll put a link in when we put the show out on all the various platforms. We'll chuck a link in there to the Churchill Fellowship.
That would be excellent.
Thanks, Neal. Thanks everyone for listening or tuning in at home or wherever you are. Stay tuned to your regular email updates, both from SSAA National and SSAA Victoria, for the latest of what's going on. Stay tuned to our social media. Just locally here in Victoria, we've got some great training courses coming up throughout the state, both at our metro ranges and regionally. So whether you're new or experienced, or for work or play, there's that delineation between the pro colours and the recreational coming in, but it's very much comes in our training courses because that's the world we live in. There is a course for you that SSAA Victoria is offering, so details on the website, and thank you for listening and watching.